ballot season is not just upon us, it's almost over. And in just 2 days, if you're listening to this Sunday evening with a nice wintry drink in your hands or scooting home after a Get Out the Vote event, Massachusetts residents will not just be casting their votes for president, but for 5 ballot measures that could tweak or reshape institutions. I'm Jennifer Smith.
And I'm Dumcius.
And this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts.
Today, we're going to talk with each other and our Commonwealth Beacon colleagues about an interesting thread running through all 5 of these ballot measures, workplaces and workforces.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an odd kind of thing to look at this array of ballot measures and try and figure out if there's some commonality. And we're going to get into that, but then a very quick primer on what we're actually talking about here. So question 1 would allow the state auditor to audit the legislature. Question 2 would eliminate the 10th grade MCAS as a graduation requirement. Question 3 would allow rideshare drivers like those for Uber and Lyft to essentially figure out their own collective bargaining unit and collectively bargain as a union. Question 4 would legalize certain psychedelic substances and change the way that we may or may not be allowed to consume magic mushrooms and the like. And question 5 would essentially raise the minimum wage for tipped workers. So that's what we're looking at. And Gin, did these questions seem obviously connected to you when they first got certified and survived legal challenges to be on the ballot? They seemed pretty diffuse to me initially.
Yeah, I think we had a couple of conversations in the newsroom about this, and I think in previous ballot cycles, we've often tried to look for that common thread, and it's been probably a lot easier. Past cycles have included more pocketbook issues. In this case, as you said, it looks like a lot of different sectors, a lot of different places. But I think what you and I, when we were talking about this, you pointed out, it's about work.
Yeah, it was a little bit strange because it made a bit more sense when you were looking at the sort of wide array of proposed ballot measures, which would have also included a very specific ballot measure that would have classified rideshare drivers as independent contractors, so very clearly changing the sort of workplace definition. But that didn't end up making it to the ballot because a settlement with the Attorney General ended up basically taking that off the table. So instead, we're looking at all of these different questions. And it suddenly struck me, I think at some point earlier this week, very late in the game, that, well, the legislature's a workplace and the person bringing it is someone who used to work there. You have questions about teachers and the role that they should be occupying within their workplaces and how they're sort of held accountable and measured. You have rideshare drivers and their ability to unionize on behalf of their workplace. You've got a new industry in psychedelics that would obviously create an entirely new set of workplaces and employment opportunities. And then you have question 5, which really gets to the main core point of how do servers relate to back of house staff? How do they relate to the management of restaurants? So suddenly all of these seem to have a really kind of core workplace or workforce thread to it. And so we're going to get into all of that in a bit more detail. But Gin, you're very much the campaign finance maestro here in the newsroom. And so you spend all of your time looking through financial disclosures. And one thing that you brought up just the other day was that weirdly, even though we're not talking about the presidential race today, there's been a presidential race angle to the way that we've seen donations actually come out and flow through. What on earth did you mean by that?
Yes, and I just want to say my only regret is that campaign finance filing reports can't be delivered to me intravenously. That's kind of the one last stuff I'd like to see happen. No, so this is something, when I've chatted with folks, it was interesting that it came up. So obviously some of these ballot questions have been in the works for a year, if not longer. More than a year ago, the impression was that, Joe Biden's going to be running for re-election. So I think you had quite a few donors that had, if they weren't very excited by the idea of Biden run again or kind of some of these races, they were looking at how do we look at these other ballot measures or places elsewhere in the country, right? And that shifted quite a bit with Kamala Harris becoming the presidential nominee just 3 months ago. And I think that's had quite, if not a wave, certainly a ripple effect across the donor class, where and you can see that where the amount of money that she's been pulling in as it's gotten closer to election day. and I think you're seeing that play out too on a smaller scale in with the ballot measures and who's struggling to raise money and where that money is going. And again, we'll get into this a little further, but definitely not necessarily a surprise. Most of the money on either side of these ballot questions is coming either from wealthy individuals or businesses and unions. And those are the two groups that have historically in Massachusetts had enough money to basically write these massive checks.
Well, we're going to get into these in chronological order because we are not trying to confuse anybody. We are going to start with the workplace that is actually closest to the Commonwealth offices, the State House itself. And for that, we are joined by our illustrious leader, our editor here at Commonwealth Beacon, Bruce Mohl, who is probably, at this point, most familiar with the literal hallways of the State House than anybody else on staff. Bruce, you ready to talk about work?
I am. Fire away.
Okay, so the workplace that we are literally talking about here is the state legislature, and a ballot measure that is brought by one of the former employees of said state legislature in basically every possible capacity here, as an aide, as a rep, as a senator. We're talking about Diana DiZoglio. She wants to look into the books of her former workplace. What struck you about that dynamic?
You can look at it a lot of different ways, but I remember when she was running for auditor, this sort of just popped out that she would audit the legislature. I think it was in not a debate, but a discussion with her rival for the Democratic primary. I think it was sort of initially dismissed as auditors don't do that. That's not what auditors do. And I think most previous auditors would agree with that. But it sort of hit a nerve in two ways. DiZoglio, as you say, was an aide in the legislature. She was a representative and she was a senator. She was always sort of on the outs with her bosses or the power structure there. And then she said, I want to audit them, which was sort of a personal thing, maybe a little bit. But that struck political gold. Suddenly, everybody sort of says, yeah, why not? Let's audit those guys. They get away with murder up there. Let's do an audit of them. And she's sort of built a coalition around this that people on the left who are disgruntled with the legislature and people on the far right who are disgruntled with the legislature. And then the vast majority in the middle who just sort of say, I don't know how that place works. They all say, yeah, this is a good way to maybe send a message more than anything else.
I think that's a really sharply observed point there, because one of the kind of defining natures of the legislature as a workplace, both inside of it and also outside of it, is how it deals with or doesn't deal with the question of transparency, how obvious it is why the decisions that are being made in the way that they are. And so DiZoglio, in talking about her experience there, was bringing up a number of things that she personally didn't like in terms of how the workplace, even though it sometimes sounds a little odd to say it that way, runs, like not having very much time to read bills before voting on them, the historic use of non-disclosure agreements, which she herself was under and then broke, and then also kind of the top-down structure. And so before I ask again the money question, I think, Bruce, the thing that would be helpful for me here is, how have you thought about the unusual nature, if you'll allow me a leading question, of this not being a legislator who kind of rabble-rouses from inside anymore, but this idea to kind of depart the institution to try and use outside tools to kind of crack things open a little bit?
I think it might be fair to say that she realized challenging the power structure from within is like beating your head against a wall. It's probably not going to change very much. And I think she discovered that on a number of fronts, even when she successfully drew attention to the problems in the legislature. So as the auditor, now she has some standing to do an audit of the legislature. And she just recently issued an audit of the legislature where she sort of signaled that she'd look at a lot of the humdrum things that auditors generally look at when they're auditing an organization, but also these political power structures. How does the speaker appoint all the people to leadership that will define his power structure? Why is it he has total control of that? Why not disperse that power some way? What I keep saying is she's hit political gold with this. If she wants to stay auditor, this will give her leverage to do that. If she wants to run for higher office, I think it has given her great visibility to do so. Whether she's going to actually change what she perceives as the structure of the legislature, I think you've raised it. There are some legitimate reasons they don't talk openly when they're horse trading over this or that. You can understand that. But the power structure, the ability to just change rules whenever they want to. You're seeing that right now up there. They theoretically supposed to end the session July 31st. But no, they didn't get it done, so they're just going to continue to do it. And they make up rules like we'll have full formal sessions when we get a committee vote report. It's sort of astounding, but they're in charge, so they can do whatever they want.
And again, I'm going to give you the easiest of all of these questions that we're going to have today, which is, what's this look like in terms of support and opposition? There's not really money in this on the opposition side, is there?
Bruce reported that the legislative leaders were basically saying, you know what, it's not really worth mounting an opposition effort to this. We're going to deal with it in the courts if it passes. And then obviously they told a bunch of us reporters the other week that they're open to tinkering with it via, legislation. The legislature, if they wanted to, could repeal it, as they did with clean elections law more than 20 years ago. So no money coming in on the opposition side. On the pro side, similar to what Bruce was saying, there's been money coming in from the left and the right. A lot of money coming in from where DeZoglio's power base has historically been, Methuen and the surrounding area there, which tends to be a little more conservative Democrat. And then you also have folks like Ernie Bach Jr., a Donald Trump supporter, who has helped out with this effort. So it's an interesting array of folks. Obviously, with this question, a lot of what's really going to get going is once the ballots are done counting. What happens after Tuesday?
All right. Well, that's speed round on question 1. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for letting me join in.
And joining us now is Michael Jonas, executive editor. When he and I are not talking about Boston politics and getting way too nerdy about that, Michael is our resident expert on education. So we wanted him to talk about MCAS and the MCAS graduation requirement. Michael, first, thanks for being with us. And what can you tell us about question 2, and how does it relate to the actual jobs that teachers do? How does it affect their workplace? And what are they trying to do here with this question?
It's a great question because I think on the face of it, the ballot question is about students, right? It's about a graduation test that Massachusetts students have been required to pass to get a high school diploma. The ballot question would take that requirement away. So a lot of the focus has been on what that would mean, for students in the state, but it would have huge implications for teachers, and they're not shy about saying that. And I think then the question becomes sort of, what is that effect? I think the Mass Teachers Association, which is the force behind the ballot question, says this will free teachers up to teach a richer curriculum, to not be bound by the pressure they have felt to, as they put it, teach to the test. The arguments have been that the MCAS requirement has narrowed the curriculum. That's the term you hear invoked a lot by opponents of it, and that it's forced teachers to, into this kind of compliance-oriented focus on what kids need to be able to do to pass the test, and that's come, to the detriment of their education. So they would say it'll free up teachers, and in so doing will make for a richer educational experience for students. I think critics say, that teachers are concerned about the sort of judgment and accountability that comes their way based on how students are doing, both on an absolute level, what is their level, and are they showing progress? And so there's critics who say teachers are just sort of looking to get out from under the kind of firm measures that, many people have to look at their performance on a job. So I think that really are the two ways of looking at how it'll affect teachers.
And one thing that comes to mind, because there's been a decent amount of kind of confusion and back and forth on this as the ballot campaign actually got going, which is it's not removing the literal MCAS. It's removing it as a graduation requirement. Has there been much discussion that you've seen around the fact that the MCAS will still exist, will still have a sense of how schools are doing compared to each other, but it won't be kind of tethered to this graduation requirement, are they talking about it as though it's essentially the same thing? Or is it the idea that teachers are worried that they will be losing students who would otherwise graduate if they don't end up teaching to the test, as opposed to the idea that there's something about a diagnostic tool that allows them that flexibility? How are they talking about those as separate, if they are at all?
Well, the teachers certainly are saying the requirement and the test are separate, and they emphasize in their effort to sort of convince people to vote yes on this that the test won't go away. We'll still be able to measure how schools and kids are doing. And they certainly say, the one tangible effect will be that we won't deny diplomas to this very small number. It's around 1% of the seniors in the state that meet all their local requirements but can't clear the MCAS bar. So they say that'll be the tangible effect to not hold back a diploma from them. I think there is some question, people say, as to how useful the measure will be, especially in the high school test, if students know it's not really consequential. Will they try as hard? Will it serve as the same level of indicator of how schools are doing? So I think there is a question. But, at the same time, we have national tests that are used to compare states. Those are not high-stakes tests. It's called the NAEP test, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And those are relied on by people to see how states are doing, and they're not high stakes either. So I think there's an argument that, students sit down, they try to do their best on these tests. So, it's a little bit of a unknown at this point what it'll mean.
And there's a ripple effect here that keeps coming up, and this is getting into the GIN side of everything, which is this idea that if there's not sort of that standard around graduation requirements, it then impacts how they might do at other educational institutions, how it might go into other workplaces. What does this say about how prepared a student is? And that means, GIN, I get to kick it over to you. That has very much influenced where the money is coming from here and where kind of the opposition is coming from. So what can you tell us about what the dollars and cents tell us?
Sure. The Massachusetts Teachers Association, the union there led by Max Page, they're the main sole funder of this ballot question. They've been pouring in millions, whatever way you want to kind of slice the contribution / dollars or time. They're the main drivers here and have been for a long time. On the other side, the main funders are business groups. I think they've struggled the last few cycles when it comes to ballot measures, right? You've got the Fair Share Amendment, millionaire's tax, whatever you want to call it. They lost on that one. And then the charter schools a couple of years ago, same thing. They were trying to lift the cap on charter schools, and the unions beat them back on that as well. So as I mentioned before, wealthy individuals, Mike Bloomberg donated $2.5 million. Although that still falls well below what the teachers union has spent trying to get this passed.
Again, Michael, thank you for our bite-sized Q2 ballot conclusion. Thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely voting day, Michael.
Thanks, and same to you and to everyone out there in Codcast land.
And now this is just going to be me and Jennifer talking about question 3, unionization of Uber and Lyft drivers. Jennifer's been covering Uber Lyft issues for over a year. You know the intricacies of labor law quite well.
To my horror.
So we're gonna turn to you on this question, and the main question is how is this a workplace, or what kind of workplace are we talking about when we're talking about unionization of gig workers?
This is maybe the most attenuated workplace here. We have something that has been subject of great dispute in Massachusetts and also states across the country, which is essentially, well, what are gig workers? What are rideshare drivers? Are they the same as other employees but with more flexibility, which is what the former AG, now governor, had argued in court? Or are they something more akin to straightforwardly independent contractors? So as I mentioned up at the top, there was briefly a ballot measure that would have basically settled the question, that would have said they are independent contractors, these drivers, and that ballot measure was brought by these sort of big rideshare companies, including Uber and Lyft, who were also being sued by said Maura Healey at the time and then Andrea Campbell. But just as that was cleared to go to the ballot and maybe settle this question, Campbell ended up settling with them and saying, in exchange for you not pushing this very expensive ballot measure, we're going to demand that you establish certain baseline benefits for your workers. So the end result of this is that whether or not they are a normal working cohort of employees or independent contractors is still, technically speaking, not a settled matter in Massachusetts. So with that in mind, that is why we have this other ballot measure that is actually before folks this time, which is saying that it would create a sector-based bargaining system rather than workplace-based. So instead of, all the Starbucks workers, it would say all the people that pour coffee. In this case, it would be all of the folks who are doing this sort of rideshare gig work here. It sets out standards for selecting a group of so-called active drivers who would then represent the sector in negotiations and what they could argue for. And that sort of tactic is common in countries like France, Belgium, or New Zealand, but isn't as common here in the United States. So this would basically create a new system that's a little bit weirdly connected to the federal labor system that would essentially say gig workers have the ability to collectively bargain. So the workplace there, it's as wobbly as all hell. And the question is essentially, what are the common interests of these sorts of gig workers and who should be in charge of arguing for them?
Sure, and naturally with a unionization measure, you're going to have unions being the main backers of this. And in this case, the main one is SEIU 32BJ. They've been in the news the most in recent years over Logan Airport. They represent workers at Logan Airport, along with a couple of other places. Why do unions want workers to unionize? Well, they want more members. That gives them more power, more bargaining power, more dues, which help fund their operations. That's who's the main backer here. There has not been opposition, which is kind of surprising, right? Because we expected not necessarily the amount of spending that the other Uber Lyft ballot questions, which didn't make it, would have brought in. But I think there was some expectation that there was going to be some spending to try to defeat this one. And I haven't seen any. There hasn't even been a ballot committee formed.
That's right. And that's such a good point, too, because the way that these two ballot questions, the independent contractor one and then this unionization one, were initially sort of pitched is that they were almost in conversation with each other. This idea that if they were independent contractors, then maybe they could also have this bargaining unit, and perhaps there was a way that you could see voters saying, well, if I do independent contractors, but I'm concerned about these workers, maybe I can throw them a bone and also say they can unionize. So for instance, Attorney General Andrea Campbell, even though she settled with the companies, then said, I think I'm probably going to be backing this unionization question as well. So I think this is a very interesting one also in terms of it's probably going to end up, if anything, tangled up in courts if there's any opposition, because the question is, does the system that they're laying out for unionization conflict with essentially the way that we normally do union processes in the United States? So that one is a little bit up in the air, and I do think it's interesting, and I wonder how you feel about this, Gin, that the ones where there's no opposition seem to be because those who oppose it are pretty sure that it's gonna turn into a messy court fight later.
Yeah, that seems to be the through line on those, and which we cover the courts. You're there at the Supreme Judicial Court a couple times a month, so
A lot.
yeah, a lot. That's the best way to put it. So we'll see what happens there.
And now we're joined for the trippiest of all of the ballot questions here. Question 4, which would legalize certain types of psychedelics and create a new regime around their usage and their production and their gifting, but not sale. To talk about that, we are joined by our lovely colleague, Bhaamati Borkhetaria, who has been our resident Cannabis Control Commission maven. And the reason that that's relevant on top of the psychedelic side of things is the last time that we introduced a new vice industry by ballot measure, it was cannabis related. So, Bhaamati, thank you for joining us to talk about these two ballot related industries.
Thank you for having me.
So let's focus, as we have been, on the workplace itself here. This ballot measure would create a new and regulated industry of psychedelics, which notably would also include a new system for taking and facilitating the taking of these certain psychedelic substances. So what workplaces would be created by this ballot measure?
when it comes to this ballot measure, it's not exactly like cannabis, so it won't be the workforce that cannabis created with retail dispensaries and such. But like you mentioned, there will be sort of a therapeutic model where there will be facilitation. So the therapeutic model will create a whole suite of jobs, and mostly the biggest job that it will create is a sort of facilitator job, which will be people who are licensed to trip sit, those who come in and want a therapeutic experience with psychedelics. That'll look like someone sitting in a room with you and helping you go through the trip.
So it sounds like we're talking about something that's just not nearly at the scale of the cannabis industry, obviously, but would involve kind of new locations and people who would be charged with managing them. But, and I think this is notable here, we would not be talking about the ability to walk into a building and just purchase a mushroom, right? And then take it home with you.
Yeah, the psychedelics therapeutic model would be just a much more controlled and regulated way of doing psychedelics.
One thing that comes to mind is thinking about the sort of early days of legalized cannabis in Massachusetts, where there was a lot of concern over kind of the physical infrastructure safety itself. There was a lot of worry that people would kind of be breaking in and trying to steal the products or trying to rob cash registers, because it was at the time an entirely cash business because there weren't banks that would be cooperating here. So is there any discussion of similar concerns around the psychedelic side of things, or is it just a completely non-comparable brick and mortar industry?
I think the concerns that I've heard are more around public safety, what dangers people could face on a trip that goes badly, what dangers people could face if someone isn't properly prepared to help someone through a trip. So the concerns are more like, how could this harm someone, as opposed to as many concerns about robberies or that sort of thing.
And then there's the meta workplace of all of this, which is, as with cannabis, it creates the oversight structure and the oversight chain here. So what would that actually look like on the state level? Who would be tasked with this? And what have we learned about the way that fundamentally these are still sort of personality fraught industries or systems, even when it comes to this sort of more clinical, objective sounding oversight body?
Yeah, so this ballot measure is a very detailed ballot measure that sets up a very strict regulatory system, and it will introduce yet another five-member commission to Massachusetts. Our current five-member commission has had its issues, especially when we talk about it in terms of workforce. There have been allegations of harassment. The head of the organization has been suspended and fired. Things have been slow at the commission. The industry has been asking for so many changes, and it hasn't been super efficient. Many people in the industry, the inspector general, lawmakers have complained about how slow things have been at the CCC. So, is that the best system of regulation for yet another substance? That's a good question.
What can you tell me about how quickly things have or haven't been adopted, or how smoothly things have or haven't moved from a workforce perspective in states where there have actually put this sort of process through already?
In Oregon, where there is a therapeutic model already online, there have been hitches with the workforce when it comes to facilitators, where facilitators have joined the workforce in large numbers. People have gotten licensed, but not all of them have jobs. The service centers themselves, where this therapy would be administered, took a long time to kick off, which led to really expensive therapy for people. But also, it meant that this workforce, even though they had gotten licensed and paid upfront fees for this, are still not working in this industry.
And Gin, what does this actually look like on the back and forth side of it? You've got the literal opposition, but then there's the question of, where is that money coming from? What can that tell us about the folks who are and aren't in favor of this ballot measure?
Some of the money is coming actually from Elijah Dushku. Bhaamati talked to her the other day, and she wants a job in this new industry, sounds like. So she's donated so far $350,000. She's talked about how using psychedelics has helped her PTSD. The pro side has been very well funded. The no side, actually, I think they've only pulled in about $100,000. And a good chunk of that came from SAM Incorporated, which opposed marijuana legalization when that was on the ballot in Massachusetts. But they've donated about $100,000, so pretty much most of the money has come from them. I'm curious to see how voters react to this, because it's, medical marijuana was passed in 2012, and then 2016 full-on legalization was passed. So I'm curious to see if there's going to be a similar stepping stone process here.
Yeah, 100%. And it's a good point to raise that as well, because if I recall correctly from the most recent polls, question 4 is the one where it is kind of most on a razor's edge. Both the pro and against side right now are sitting at about 43%. So nobody's really cracking 50. And that stands obviously in pretty sharp contrast to something like the legislative audit question, where you've got the yes side pulling something in the high 60s to low 70s at this stage. So we will see if there is in fact an entirely new industry with all of its attendant kerfuffles, and we'll find that out on Tuesday. Thanks, Bhaamati.
Thank you.
And as you might expect, because we have done Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4, we are on to ballot question 5 now, which is perhaps the most obvious one when we're thinking about the connection between these ballot measures and workplaces. This is whether or not we change the systems of tips for tipped workers. Essentially, do we raise the minimum wage for those tipped workers? Gin, how has this actually kind of come across your field of vision? This has been something that's been very, very, very controversial and hasn't clearly drawn neat lines between those who are on kind of the front of house side, the back of house side, or management themselves. And of course, as you've reported, it's part of this very national movement to adjust the way that we pay tipped workers here in the United States.
Sure, and this is being led by a California activist / Berkeley professor. I mean, her argument has been that restaurant workers are low-wage workers. The industry has been really susceptible to wage theft and workers getting mistreated. So her overarching message has been one fair wage, and that's the name of the organization that's been pushing this, as well as several subsidiaries and the ballot measure. On the other side is restaurant owners, both national chains and local restaurant owners, who say the claims of mistreatment and abuse are overblown, and this model of changing, going from, in Massachusetts, it's $6.75 an hour plus tips. They're saying bring that up to $15 an hour, as well as allowing other parts of the operation to take part in a tipped pool. That will upend the industry. They claim it's going to lead to layoffs and potentially closures.
That's right. And so part of what's been so interesting to me about this measure specifically is that a lot of the focus has been around this concept of the tip pool, this idea that the waiters, the hosts, the front of house staff could, if the restaurant and the management decides to do it, then pool their tips, which could then be shared with back of house staff. And so restaurant managers say that would essentially be a debacle financially, that it would sort of undermine the tipping process. And what's been interesting to me, of course, is, well, that's a very optional thing. So in theory, that's the easiest part for them to hand wave away if they don't want to participate in that tip pooling process. But what I'm curious about, Gin, is there has been a lot of discussion about how this would or wouldn't basically change the way that we think about those sort of front of house service workers, where technically speaking, they are guaranteed that $15 an hour, but that basically means that if they make that up through tips, then the restaurant only has to kick in so much. But if they aren't making up to that $15 an hour in tips, then the restaurant has to make sure that they are paid that full amount. But this would sort of change what is described, I think, as the workplace dynamic between those sort of front of house folks and the customers. This idea that plenty of people in the States like and are used to a gratuity-based system, even as we know that the average amount of tips has gone up and up and up over the years, in part because that's considered the primary way that these front of house folks end up making their money. So I've been curious about kind of the in-restaurant dynamics that this raises, and the question of how do the back of house workers relate to the front of house workers, and is this kind of a functional system where the expectation is that those who go to eat at a restaurant essentially end up compensating for those substantial portions of the wages? Because I bet it does, as they've noted, feel very strange to be told, I know you've been making like $35 an hour based on tips, and now you have the possibility of making less than that if you only make minimum wage. But I think the thing that's still open for discussion because of how this is played out across the country is, do you actually end up capped at that minimum wage? Or is that giving restaurant patrons the opportunity to say, well, the 10% tip that I might give you now is a more accurate reflection of service, rather than something I feel obligated to give to kind of supplement your overall income? So that's been the dynamic that's been interesting to me. This one has had a lot of spending on all sides. What's that actually looked like?
There's a couple of different groups that have been funneling money towards this in favor of the question. They're linked to the One Fair Wage organization led by the California activists. Some of that money is going through what's sometimes known as a C4 or a 501c4, and that's a nonprofit that can be more politically active. What I've been told is that there's foundations that have been funding this C4, Schusterman Foundation, social justice focused organizations that are essentially funneling the money into this ballot measure. And then on the no side, it's been largely restaurant chains and local owners. And I think, anybody who's probably been out for lunch or dinner in the last couple months has seen the debate has invaded the table. Just before a doctor's appointment the other day in Quincy, I stopped in for lunch, and when I got my bill, inside the bill was campaign literature telling me vote no. And I've heard from others who say servers at some of these restaurants, when they go, servers have launched into a pitch for a no vote for this. So it's obviously that's all time and money that the restaurant owners are paying to defeat this measure. So it's definitely one of the most interesting ballot measures to watch on Tuesday.
Well, that is our run through of the 5 ballot measures that are going to be in front of everyone this Tuesday, which is so close. I hope you're all hanging in there. I am Jennifer Smith. I am joined, of course, by Dumcius, and thank you for joining us all on the Codcast and listening here. Our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We will be back next week, whatever next week looks like.